The primary goal of fish keeping is to keep fish alive and healthy. There are two radically different approaches to achieving this goal. There are tools that are common to both of these approaches: filters, lighting, heaters, food, aquariums, other tools, and some chemicals are typically used by some of these groups of fish keepers. The practices involved in maintaining the systems, however, are diametrically opposed.
Well, hello. Come right on in. You're at Father Fish.
There are, as I describe it, two fundamental approaches to keeping fish in an aquarium. The one is to keep them in the most technologically sophisticated manner possible. The other is to keep them in the most natural environment possible. Both of these approaches have very serious advocates. Both of them have the investment of countless hobbyists deeply committed to each of these two different approaches. For my part, I'm on one side and not on the other. I'm on the side of maintaining a natural system, and I oppose, sometimes very vehemently, a purely technologically approach to keeping fish alive. Why is that? Why am I so strongly opposed to the use of technology in an aquarium? Well, the truth is I'm not. I use heaters, I use lights, I use filters, I use aquariums, I use many of the tools, many of the devices, many of the systems that have been developed as technology over the last 50 to 75 years, nearly as long as I have been in the hobby. It is the attempt to remove all natural activity or primary and major activity from an aquarium that I oppose. What do I mean by this? Well, if you look in a pond or a creek or any body of water out in nature, you will find elements in that environment that are not permitted to exist in a high-tech environment. For example, the substrate. The substrate, for me, is the absolute foundation of a healthy aquarium. The purpose of the foundation is to increase the biodiversity in the aquarium. Those who do not agree to this either have no substrate or a substrate that is very shallow and frequently one that is composed of gravel or perhaps small rock, marbles, occasionally sand, but typically not sand. And it may be no more than half an inch deep, an inch at the most. Now, here's an interesting characteristic. The so-called under gravel filter. The under gravel filter is in fact an attempt to create a natural system. Now, it's one that is, I believe, fundamentally flawed, but it nevertheless is based on the idea that waste brought into the substrate will create an environment in which that waste will break down into its components and be able to feed plants. It breaks down by virtue of biological activity. So The undergravel filter is dependent upon biological activity. It is not, strictly speaking, a high-tech system at all. In point of fact, it is quite the reverse. The undergravel filter was very popular for many years. It came out in the 60s, the 1960s, as a way to be able to maintain an aquarium long-term without having to do substantial cleaning. Now, typically those tanks were cleaned once a year, once every 6 months, but on an occasional basis. And they were cleaned because they literally filled up with waste product, which became soil. Here's an interesting feature of that system. It is at the point where the substrate, the gravel, sitting on top of the plate that was pulling water through, the point at which that gravel became completely clogged with detritus, it was at that point that the filter was functioning at its most effective level. It was functioning as a genuine deep substrate. I have long recommended to folks who have undergravel filter systems to simply add an inch of sand to the top of it and pull out the lift tube and let that act as a plenum so that detritus will continue to precipitate down into the sand, into that gravel, forming a soil layer. And it is enormously effective. There are countless hobbyists who have done this over the past few years and are very, very happy with the results. So let's put the undergravel filter system on my side of the equation. On the other side is the half-inch of gravel. The half-inch of gravel is essentially there for show. It serves little other function because it needs to be cleaned routinely. And in point of fact, the hobbyist with a system that has little or no hardscape, little or no live plants, and a thin layer of substrate with filtration, typically hang on the back filtration, canister filtration, rarely, if ever, sponge filter filtration. What happens to that water after about a week of regular feeding is that the water becomes thick, heavy with organics. There's nothing in the system to remove the organics. Now, organics are not solid matter. I'm not talking about detritus. I'm talking about elements that are dissolved in the water that causes the water to become heavy with an organic composition. Things that dissolve, things like calcium, things like sugars, things like protein, things that are more elemental perhaps, more microscopic perhaps, things that become a part of the water column. As the fish are fed and they create waste, urine, for example, begins to fill up that water system. Some of it is removed. It's removed by the bacteria that grows in the filter and in whatever little substrate there is that breaks down the ammonia into nitrites, and nitrites then into nitrates. There is, however, nothing in that system to remove nitrates, and so they build up. The perfect example of an organic that is building up to proportions that are essentially unhealthy. So that tank requires routine maintenance. The maintenance is primarily of two sorts. It's changing out a substantial amount of the water and cleaning the substrate, so-called siphon pumping the substrate. That will be done on a regular weekly basis. It becomes possible to replace the water in the tank with new water that does not have the organics in it, thereby reducing the percentage of organics. Now, rarely is that 100% water change. Typically, it's 25%, 50%, 75%. So it's reducing the dissolved organics by up to 75%. That increases over the following week. The same amount of water is taken out, but now the organics are even richer than they were before because you have that initial 25%. You have the additional organics that have dissolved in the water over the last week, raising the level incrementally. Eventually, in a year or so, that water becomes so heavy with organics that the whole tank needs to be broken down. If it is not, the high levels of organics in the water will begin to stress the fish. It will not be as active, not be feeding as well, and will lose its vigor, becoming more susceptible to disease and parasites. So long term, that approach to fish keeping requires considerable and substantial intervention. On the other hand, with a deep substrate system and lots of plants growing in the water, in the substrate and in the water column, anubias, for example, which are taking nutrients directly out of the water column and not out of the substrate at all. Rooted plants such as swords and vallisneria are taking nutrients out of the substrate, in addition to perhaps some floating plants that are absorbing nutrients directly from the water. The combination of those plants reduces the dissolved organics in the water and converts the waste that is precipitating into the substrate into nutrients that the plants are then able to convert into stems, leaves, flowers, the plant. That system, which is a natural system that goes on all over the earth as a function of the ecosphere, the living organisms on the earth, is a completely natural one, which is very simply and very easily duplicated in a fish tank. Now, I say that knowing there are those who are absolutely convinced that an aquarium cannot be maintained as a biotope. In other words, you can't have nature in an aquarium because, well, it's a little glass box and it's too small and it doesn't get rain in it and it doesn't get wind blowing across it. It doesn't get leaves falling in it. It doesn't get sunlight. And all of that is true. However, there are bodies of water that also don't get rain, don't get wind blowing across them, don't get any kind of effective water change, don't even get much in the way of sunlight on them. So it's not different in that respect. There are ways, however, to accommodate those conditions, and that's where I take advantage of the technology that is available to be able to replicate sunlight, an impossible task. We cannot create a light as bright as the sun, but we can create lighting, and I believe LEDs have given us a wonderful way to be able to get directed light comparable to sunlight into an aquarium. We can also leave it on for long periods of time in order to be able to come closer to reaching the lumen level that the sun provides to plants. Water evaporates out of aquariums. As it is replaced, that is rain accommodating the evaporation. That's a natural process that occurs. Now, it's not raining in our house, but as the water level evaporates, we do want to top it off. We do want to replace it. I replace that water with my regular tap water. And the reason I do that is because all of the plants and all of the other life, including the microfauna and macrofauna and the fish for that matter, that are in the tank are absorbing nutrients, and not just nutrients, but absorbing the hardness, absorbing the dissolved minerals that are in the water, causing the water to become softer. So I add tap water. My tap water is very hard. There's some who have very soft tap water. That's a completely different issue, and really not one I have ever encountered. Everywhere I've ever lived has had very hard water. So I frankly would not know what to do if I were confronted with very soft water. I probably would find myself adding minerals or adding some kind of substrate containing minerals in order to be able to beef that water up. On the other hand, I might decide to keep fish and whatever kind of plants I could that would survive well in soft acid water. It's not an issue I'm dealing with, but one that certainly can be dealt with in a natural environment. Very well. So the fish tank set up as a biotop with a substrate capable of allowing detritus, allowing waste to precipitate into it, to break down and to nurture, to feed not only the plants, but all of the microscopic life, all of the microfauna, the bacteria, the fungus, everything else that's living in that environment that feeds on those precipitated materials. All of that is fed on, and it breaks down more and more and more until finally the bacteria breaks down what is left into its final constituent components, which are taken up by the roots of plants, thereby creating a cycle. It takes a long time for that cycle to occur. It may take as long as 5 years for the cycle to become a stable one. So I create a substrate that has a very substantial amount of minerals and other components in it, such that it will last for a few years at least to give that system a chance to be able to become a cycled system. I also add leaf mulch, and not just any leaves, but leaves out of a body of water that contain living on them all of the organisms that cause that wild environment to be able to thrive, that actually break down the waste and consume it and create tinier amounts. Also create macrofauna that feed many of the fish and other smaller life forms in the body of water. So it really does become possible to maintain a very balanced, a very natural, a very living and thriving environment in the aquarium, as opposed to trying to kill everything in order to prevent that from happening. I think that approach, the approach of using chemicals to kill algae, for example, an algicide, to kill bacteria, for example, a bactericide. Those things create a toxic environment in the tank that eventually attacks the fish that the fish keeper is trying to keep healthy. And it breaks down that fish's ability to withstand any kind of attack by parasites, by viruses, by any sort of infective agent or disease creating agent. So the approach of heavy chemicals, constant cleaning, constantly trying to maintain a sterile environment, I believe is dangerous. It is counterintuitive. Ultimately, it is counterproductive and eventually will lead to the fish that are being kept in that way dying before they otherwise would have died. They will become stressed by an environment that is so synthetic that it does not give the fish the benefit of all of the bacterial, the biological activity that that fish needs in order to maintain its slime coat, in order to maintain its vibrancy, in order to maintain its ability to withstand the impact of agents that might otherwise cause it to become sick. So I'll leave you with this. There is, I believe, an approach to fish keeping that is being practiced, it is being taught in virtually every store. It is being taught by virtually all of the manufacturing agents who promulgate all of these products. It is being taught by an industry that has put the dollar sign before the health of the fish and before the ability of the hobbyist to be able to maintain that aquarium long-term as a healthy environment. I challenge you to set up a natural aquarium. Overcome your fear and anxiety of the natural world and realize that we are here not because of technological advances, but because of our ability to farm and to nurture the natural environment in a way that improves our health. Whenever some foreign agent is introduced to us that is of a purely technological nature, it inevitably causes us stress, distress, illness, and death. When we can develop our technological skills to make use of the natural processes in nature and be able to bring them into our lives, into our aquarium, we achieve a higher degree of health, our aquariums thrive, and we are happier. This principle is one that will determine our survival as a species. We will either learn to live in harmony with nature by farming, by being husbandry men and women of nature in such a way as to allow ourselves and the natural system to thrive. Reducing our population, killing off substantial numbers of people in the process, separating ourselves from the natural world, reducing our ability to farm our land. All of those are destructive of our very existence here on this earth. And I, for one, firmly believe that we are here by design. We are here to be the keepers of this earth. That is our charge. That is our burden. That is our most fundamental responsibility. We are not foreigners to the earth. We are not interlopers. We are not here by accident, but by design. To do what is best, what is healthiest for ourselves and for all of the other creatures with whom we live. Beginning with those little fish and that little aquarium. Let that be the lesson for you, the life lesson, to learn to allow those animals to thrive in the way they best can thrive, by allowing yourself to encourage natural dynamics, natural parts of the environment, the natural world, to live in that little aquarium, and for you to live in the natural world. Love you all. Bless you all. Bye for now.